Hello friends, my name is JJ, and here on this channel, we like to talk about culture. But sometimes I think I talk a bit too much about the material side of culture, you know, like food and drinks and toys and all of that. But culture also manifests in plenty of non-material ways, of course. Stuff like traditions and stories and mythical creatures. And a good example of this type of culture, both in American culture and the culture of the broader West, is the Zodiac. Everybody knows the Zodiac, right? Those 12 weird creatures with even weirder names that line up with your birthday and supposedly reveal the deepest truths about your personality. Now, I don't want to get into the whole history of astrology and horoscopes, because that's a whole video unto itself. Instead, I thought it might be interesting to just take a step back and observe some of the ways in which the zodiac symbols have integrated themselves into our culture more broadly. So, the basic gist of the horoscope is that the 12 signs are based on constellations that were first identified and named by ancient Greek astronomers, which were later organized into a sequence tracking the path in which the sun appeared to move around the Earth. I think that we can sometimes overstate just how much of our contemporary culture is influenced by the ancient Greeks and Romans, but when it comes to how we think and talk about outer space, their impact is pretty undeniable. 2,000 years later, and we are still using their names for constellations, and millions of us still claim to find personal relevance in their confused theories about how the planets work. That said, the zodiac only gained its modern popularity during a boom of interest in occult-type things that occurred in late 19th century Britain and America, which then gave rise to a bunch of new middle-class traditions that incorporated once taboo and unchristian topics into daily life. Horoscope newspaper columns became particularly popular after World War II, and during the heyday of American newspaper publishing in the early 90s, horoscopes were apparently being printed in over 1,400 daily papers across the US, or upwards of 80% of them. This played a huge role in making these things a part of mainstream cultural literacy. So today, I thought we would go through each of the 12 signs one at a time and give an example or two of the ways in which these names and characters have embedded themselves into the culture in a way that goes beyond just this. So let's begin with my sign, which is probably the most unattractively named of them all, Cancer, the crab. Cancer is, of course, the name of the worst disease in the world, an incurable illness associated with horrible, deadly tumors. According to this award-winning book on cancer, the emperor of all maladies, the disease was named by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, who thought that cancerous tumors looked a bit like crabs, with the tumor as the body and all of the gross engorged veins feeding into it looking like the legs. For all of the attention that cancer gets in our culture today, as the disease that we are most preoccupied with raising money to fight and cure, it is interesting that the crab has never really taken off as a popular symbol of it. I mean, it's on the cover of this book, but that feels a bit cheeky. I guess it's because in the modern culture, we like to focus on cancer from the perspective of survivors and portray it as something that people can endure with dignity and strength, which makes symbols like daffodils and pink ribbons much more useful than some giant, gross bug. Here is another fun cancer fact. Man, what am I saying? In Holland, it is a common swear word. You spend any time in the Netherlands and sooner or later you will encounter someone yelling "cancer" after getting cut off in traffic. Leo, the lion, feels like one of the signs that has integrated deepest into our culture, which might have something to do with the fact that it is also one of the most common signs for people to have. It is the only sign that has become a popular first name for one. In addition to just Leo itself, many Western countries have names derived from Leo, including Leon, Leonel, Leonard, Leonardo, and Leonie, all of which come from the fact that it is just cool to be named after a lion. We tend to think of Leo as a pretty good default name for a lion itself, similar to like Rover for a dog, and you often see uninspired lion plushies or cartoon characters or mascots named Leo. The most famous Leo the lion of all, however, is probably this guy, the roaring lion from the MGM Studios logo. MGM actually filmed multiple different versions of this over the years, using many different lions before eventually settling on this version in 1957, which they used for decades and starred a lion named Leo. MGM is now owned by Amazon, and the intro is now done all in CG, but he is still officially known as Leo. Taurus, the bull, is a powerful name, often used to market macho-type things. For example, what could possibly be more rugged and masculine than the mighty Ford Taurus, America's best-selling mid-size family sedan from 1992 to 1996. I have a lot of personal sentimentality about this particular car, since as we learned from my award-winning video about the material possessions that defined my middle-class upbringing, it was a particular favorite in the McCullough household when I was growing up. The Taurus is still around today, of course, and I feel like it's now considered about as basic as a middle-class family car can get. But when it first debuted back in 1986, it was considered a pretty big deal. At the time, Ford had been looking to reboot their fortunes after years of losing market share to the Japanese, so the Taurus was their big make-or-break gamble, and it paid off handsomely and quickly dominated the domestic market. Among other things, car historians often hold up the Taurus as heralding a real aesthetic revolution in the American carscape, transitioning customers away from the boxy designs of the 60s and 70s and towards the smooth, round-edged looking cars that we all take for granted as normal today. The Taurus was also seen as being quite powerful for a middle-class car of its time, and it enjoyed a ton of favorable press, complete with plenty of bull puns. Gemini, the twins, has become a name often associated with cool, futuristic things for some reason. These days, its most prominent cultural manifestation is probably Google's AI system. But if we were living in the 60s, we would probably say it was NASA's Gemini space program, which employed these iconic two-man space shuttles as part of the lead up to the Apollo moon mission. My personal favorite Gemini thing, however, is Gemini Man from Mega Man 3. For those who don't know, Mega Man was a very popular video game franchise in the 80s and 90s, in which you had to fight all of these different characters called something man. And in Mega Man 3, one of them was called Gemini Man, and he lived on this very 80s looking neon moon base. When you fought him, he split into two and shot Gemini lasers at you. There's like a billion different Mega Man bad guys now, but as far as I'm aware, Gemini Man is the only one they ever made based on a Zodiac sign. Aries, the ram, is another zodiac thing that you sometimes see used as a given name, though it's nowhere near as common as Leo. There's a famous American track and field runner named Aries Merritt, for instance. Fans of pro wrestling might be aware of Austin Aries, who has been a figure in that world for much of the last 20 years or so, though mostly in non-WWE leagues that non-wrestling fans like myself have never heard of. Aries is not his actual name, however. He apparently just thought that naming himself after his astrological sign would make him sound more badass. And that's all I got. Apologies to any Aries people watching this who find this one a little bit lame, but your sign just really hasn't permeated the culture that deeply. Virgo, the Virgin, is another very popular sign, owing to how many people tend to have birthdays in September or August. The CDC released some data a while back about the most common birthdays in the US, and literally all but one of the top 10 were Virgos. Virgo is one of two signs where the Latin name of the thing it describes isn't much different from the word we use today, which doesn't really make it that exciting. That said, we can certainly say that stuff relating to virgins and virginity are everywhere in our culture, from the Virgin Mary to virgin olive oil to virgin music to that virgin meme guy. The American state of Virginia is named after the virginity of Queen Elizabeth I. We used to think it was great for women to be virgins, and I guess we still do to some extent, but in modern America, I feel like virginity is more often used as a signifier that a man is very lame and dorky, like the 40-year-old virgin or those virginity rocks shirts that hipsters like to wear, ironically. Libra, the scale, is probably my favorite example of a zodiac thing that is very present in the culture, but easy to miss. So in ancient Latin, Libra meant scale or balance, but it was also the word used for a common unit of weight used in Roman society. When the Romans conquered Britain, they brought this concept with them, which the British eventually turned into their concept of a pound, which is then what they named their currency after, because of course in the old days, a currency was supposed to be an abstraction of the weight of gold and other things. And since the British continued to use Latin for official business until the 18th century, this is why the English-speaking world still uses the abbreviation LB to mean pound, and why the British use this swirly L as the symbol of their money. This is also the story behind the name of the old Italian currency, the lira, as well. Scorpio, the scorpion, is the other zodiac symbol where the name is basically the same as the modern English word. So the concept of a Scorpio as something different from a scorpion has never really caught on. That said, I feel like Scorpio is the most iconic of all the zodiac signs, with Scorpio people often used as a cliche embodying the entire concept of astrology itself. This is probably because within astrology, Scorpios tend to be stereotyped as having a bunch of very dramatic and edgy personality traits, like being very passionate and sexual and dark and moody and all of that.
What's your sign?
Scorpio.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
No.
Of course, as a big Simpsons fan, I have to give a shout out to one of the show's most beloved one-off characters, Hank Scorpio. I don't know enough about astrology to say if Hank has any particularly Scorpio-like traits. I feel like the idea was more that because he's this kind of Bond villain type character, he should have a name that is slightly familiar, but also slightly weird in the way that Bond villains often do.
I wouldn't point fingers, you jerk.
Sure, do you expect me to talk?
I don't expect anything from you except to die and be a very cheap funeral.
Sagittarius, the archer, sometimes the centaur archer, is a pretty unpopular sign, both in terms of how rare it is for people to be it and how little visibility it has in the broader culture. I mean, centaurs are certainly a pretty popular cultural symbol, but people just tend to call them centaurs, not Sagittarii. The practice of archery was once called sagittary, but the Oxford English Dictionary tells me that that term hasn't been in use since the late 17th century. The best thing I could come up with is an old Showa-era anime called Yuchusen Sagittarius, or Spaceship Sagittarius. The internet tells me it was successful, but I've never heard of it. Have you? Okay, I got a really good one for Pisces the fish. It is a story I learned from a very cool podcast called The Best Idea Yet. If you like this channel, you'll probably like them. So in 1958, there was this guy from Switzerland called Oscar Cambly, head of the Cambly Cracker Corporation, and he wanted to get a special present for his wife for her birthday, and I guess she was tired of getting the same old crackers every year, so he tried to come up with something clever. And because Mrs. Crambley was born under Pisces, the sign of the fish, he invented these for her. Goldfish crackers. Now perhaps the world's most beloved fish-shaped cracker. Inventing a new cracker based on your wife's astrological sign isn't the sort of thing you could just do for anyone. I mean, it's hard to imagine kindergartners going to school with a little Ziploc baggie of Virgo crackers. Capricorn, the goat mermaid, is the second sign, after Sagittarius, that takes the form of a mythical creature. But I have to say, the goat fish isn't exactly something that's really captured the public's imagination over the millennia. You almost never see it pop up in pop culture. It's just too weird. Capricorn does have a lot of geographic relevance, however, thanks to the Tropic of Capricorn, which is one of the 5 lines of latitude we use to split the world into 6 horizontal zones. The Tropic of Capricorn comes after the equator and marks off this warm southern slice of the globe. Tropic of Capricorn was also the title of a rather notorious 1939 novel by the American writer Henry Miller, which documented the author's various sexual misadventures and graphic detail. It was published when Miller was living in France, and for many decades it was banned from libraries and bookstores in the US on the grounds of indecency. Today you will often see it in little displays of the most famous banned books of the 20th century. Tropic of Capricorn was actually a prequel to a book that Miller had written a few years earlier called Tropic of Cancer, in reference to the line marking the boundary of the warm zone north of the equator, but Cancer already got its thing. Aquarius, the water bearer, is often said to be the least popular sign, since people don't tend to have birthdays in January or February. Those are more popular as the conception months. As a cultural thing, Aquarius is probably most associated with a popular single from the 1967 Broadway musical Hair, Age of Aquarius. This was a play all about hippies and the 60s counterculture, and Age of Aquarius was the opening number, introducing the audience to the general vibe of the show. The term Age of Aquarius was a meme that was popular at the time and referred to a concept in astrology where the late 20th century marks our planet's transition out of one 2,000-year era and into a new one. The last 2,000 years was the Age of Pisces, which was defined by the emergence of Christian civilization. So the dawning of the Age of Aquarius was kind of thrilling because it meant everything was going to be different now, man, which really played into the revolutionary optimism and rebelliousness of the time. As someone who is pretty credulous about the pseudoscience of decadology and eras and all of this, I think the idea of an Age of Aquarius is a pretty compelling one. I mean, the late 20th century does feel like the ending of something more substantial than just any old millennium, right? Alrighty, so there you go. A bunch of things that allude to the 12 signs of the Zodiac and play with our knowledge of them with varying degrees of creativity. I'm sure you guys can think of a bunch of good examples that I missed. And tell me what you think about your own sign. As a cultural symbol, I mean, not as something that purports to represent your personality. I used to think that my sign was objectively the worst, but now having made this video, I think it might actually be Aries or Sagittarius. I mean, it does suck to be associated with a killer disease, but at least it's famous. Anyway, let me know in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.